Alright, so part two, we're going to talk about the ex situ conservation of animals, so conserving animals outside of their natural habitat, which obviously is going to be a zoo or a wildlife park. And in these zoos and wildlife parks, what they focus on is a captive breeding program. So you take these endangered species and you breed them in captivity, so in the zoo or wildlife park. And the idea is that you're going to ultimately save them from extinction. Now, in an ideal world, those animals that are bred in captivity, so the babies as a result of this breeding program, should be reintroduced into the wild to restore the original populations. So they should be putting back into their natural habitat to help boost the population numbers in the wild. But there are some issues with breeding programs in general, some difficulties, and then there are further difficulties and kind of problems with trying to reintroduce captive animals. So in terms of the captive breeding program, there is not enough space or sufficient resources in zoos and parks for all endangered species. So every single endangered species is out there can't be in a captive breeding program because there's only so much room, there's only so much money in the world. So zoos and parks tend to kind of have to pick what animals they want to exhibit and have in their breeding programs. So it's not kind of a fix all for every single organism. And it's often difficult to provide the right conditions for breeding, even if we know what they are. So scientists might know, that mating season for a particular bird is during the wet season in their native country. So, they could make their display or, where they live, their area, I don't want to say cage, but you know what I mean. Their exhibit, they could make it, mimic that. They can use water sprays and things to kind of mimic rain. So scientists might know that and they might do all of that, but it can be hard to either recreate those conditions in the first place, or even when you recreate them, it can be difficult to get those animals to actually breed. So giant pandas are your prime example. Anytime a giant panda is born in captivity, it's kind of in the news and it's a big deal because they are notoriously difficult to breed in zoos. Even though scientists know kind of the situation and the environment they want, they're just really kind of sensitive to like little changes and things like that. So that's your issue or issues or difficulties with captive breeding. Once you've done that, as I said, the aim is to kind of reintroduce them, but there are problems with that. So reintroduction to the wild will be unsuccessful unless the original reason for kind of the species being nearly extinct, so the original threat is removed. So if the reason why your giant panda is under threat is because of habitat loss, unless you solve the problem of habitat loss, there's no point putting that panda back into the wild because it's going to be under the same threat as all the other animals there. So unless you're kind of reintroducing it to a changed environment, it's kind of pointless. Animals that have been bred in captivity may have great problems adjusting to unsupported life in the wild. So, lots of zoos and safari parks and things pride themselves on being really hands-off. They're not jumping in the cage and kind of treating them like pets and playing with them. But ultimately, the animals are fed. It could be, to try and mimic the same frequency as in the wild. So, they might not be fed every day. They might feed them, every 3 days or once a week or whatever. But ultimately, food is given to them. Medical care is given to them. Shelter is given to them. So they do live a supported life, albeit it could be quite hands-off. So obviously, when those animals are put into the wild, they might struggle to kind of fend and protect themselves. Reintroduction can be time-consuming and expensive. So, imagine moving an animal, a lion or an elephant, from a zoo in Europe and trying to ship that, or a zoo in America and trying to ship it back to kind of an African nature reserve. It's obviously going to be time-consuming, very expensive, and ultimately it might not work anyway because of the couple of reasons we've said previously. Also, there's an issue for zoos and captive breeding programs in that obviously within your zoo you've got quite a small population and it's a fixed, stable population. You don't have migration or anything like that. You might have, a pride of maybe 9 or 10 lions, but that's it. The males don't, wander around. There is no competition. So your gene pool is quite reduced. You have quite a small gene pool. And so as we've kind of spoken about previously, small gene pools and small populations can be a problem because that population could be at risk of a mutation kind of being more common than it is in the general population. And obviously you've got reduced gene frequencies and reduced kind of genetic diversity. So there's all their problems associated with that, that they're all kind of similar, so they're at, a higher risk of vulnerability to kind of changes. How the zoo deals with that is that it keeps very detailed and accurate records about kind of the genetic history and the pedigree of their animals. So, zoos often might swap animals to kind of artificially mix up the gene pool a little bit. And they could also use artificial insemination. So they can use kind of semen samples from other animals outside of their collection to try and increase the gene pool a little bit. So with conservation, you're kind of trying to keep the habitat safe, and kind of minimise the loss of biodiversity. But some people would argue that sustainability, which is preventing the loss of biodiversity in the first place, is more important. So instead of kind of trying to fix the problem and repair it after it's been done, stop it even happening in the first place. And sustainability is going to kind of focus on encouraging sustainable methods of land use. So the two examples that you need to be aware about are sustainable forestry and sustainable agriculture. So in illegal logging operations, they kind of focus on this technique of slash and burn. So you're cutting down the trees and selling the wood. That's the slash part and kind of the logging part. And then you burn the land and you sell it for farming. So in burning it, you're stopping it kind of ever-growing trees again, which obviously is not sustainable. Instead, if you're kind of focusing on sustainable forestry methods, you harvest the trees selectively and then you replant for the future biodiversity. And so what that means is you kind of say, okay, this many trees in this section are going to be cut down during this period of time. We're going to replant them in this period of time, and then we're going to, move on to the next section. So in this way, you can maintain your biodiversity, but people can still use the forest for an income. So obviously you can't cut off that income, from groups of people, but you can do it in a way that is sustainable, so you're not destroying whole habitats and kind of biodiversity for the future. Sustainable agriculture is another big one, another kind of big buzzword, and it focuses on using farming methods that minimise damage to the environment and avoid a monoculture, which is where you grow a single crop, because that's obviously not good, because one crop considerably less biodiverse than, lots of crops. So how we do sustainable agriculture, or kind of methods of sustainable agriculture, are we use organic fertilisers. You need to minimise the use of artificial fertilisers and chemical pesticides. You need to use biological pest control, and we maintain hedgerows, and you kind of plant in rotation. So in this area of soil, I'm going to grow this plant. Okay, then I'm going to leave that soil for a year so the minerals can replenish, and I'm going to grow in this bit of my farm this plant. As well as kind of focusing on sustainable methods, education is obviously important. So people need to be aware, and various environmentalists and charity promote an education so that the general kind of population understands the impact of human activities on the natural world and gets the ways in which people can act to protect animals, plants and habitats. If you don't have that education, then kind of no one knows why they're doing it or how to change their behaviours. All right, that is it. We are done. Last bit of content.